Hey guys, tonight we're heading into post-war Japan to understand an organization that operated so openly for so long it published its own newsletters, and yet remained almost impossible to actually stop for the better part of a century. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always nice to see who's drifting off with us tonight from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine you're a peddler in 17th century Japan. You sell things at festival markets, some of it perfectly ordinary, some of it, let's say, generously described. There's no mall management office to assign you a stall, no customer service line for disputes, and definitely no small claims court interested in hearing that the man 2 stalls over stole your corner spot again this year, like he did last year, like he did the year before that. If someone wrongs you, the law simply has no opinion on the matter. It was written for farmers, for landowners, for the fixed classes that a rigid feudal society considered worth regulating. A traveling vendor selling questionable tonics at a shrine festival did not make the list. So you and everyone like you do the only sensible thing available. You build your own law instead. You agree on territory, festival by festival, town by town. You appoint someone senior, someone with enough years in the trade to be trusted, to settle arguments before they turn into something worse. Congratulations, you've just invented middle management, several centuries before anyone thought to put it on a business card, and considerably before anyone thought to invent the business card itself. These vendors were called the tekia, and their entire existence depended on solving a problem that never really goes away. What do you do when the people meant to protect you have no interest in doing so? You could wait patiently for the law to notice you exist, or you could simply write your own version of it, enforce it yourselves, and get on with your day. The tekia chose the second option, and it worked well enough that their internal system outlived several shoguns. Now imagine a slightly different life. You're a traveling gambler instead, moving along the highways that connect Japan's major cities, setting up dice games in the back rooms of roadside inns for travelers looking to pass a long evening. Same fundamental problem as the peddler, wearing a different coat. Gambling is illegal under the shogunate, which means that if somebody stiffs you on a bet or accuses you of using loaded dice, you cannot exactly march into a magistrate's courtroom and present your case. The law does not recognize your business as existing, which is a peculiar kind of freedom and a peculiar kind of exposure at the same time. Nobody is going to help you collect a debt. Nobody is going to protect you from an accusation, fair or not. So again, you build your own system. Loyalty between senior and junior members, so that trust doesn't have to be re-established with every new game. Rituals for settling disputes over money without anyone losing a finger, or worse, over a few coins wagered on a roll of the dice. Rules about who owes what, and how quickly, and what happens when a debt goes unpaid for too long. These gamblers were the bakudo, and like the tekia, they were solving the exact same riddle from a completely different angle. When the official world will not take your calls, you simply start your own company and issue your own contracts. It's worth sitting with how strange this actually is historically speaking. Two entirely separate professions, one selling goods at festivals, the other running illegal card games along the highway, independently arrive at the identical solution. Build a private hierarchy, assign roles, write unwritten rules and enforce them consistently enough that people start to trust the system, even though no court in the land would recognize it. If you've ever worked somewhere with a rulebook nobody in senior management actually follows, you already understand why consistency mattered so much here. A system only functions as an alternative to the law if it's actually more reliable than having no system at all. The tekia and the bakudo understood this instinctively and built accordingly. These two groups, the tekia and the bakudo, are the actual ancestors of what would eventually become the Yakuza. Not a criminal mastermind plotting from a secret lair. Not a single founding figure with a grand vision for organized crime spanning centuries. Just tradespeople nobody wanted to regulate, quietly writing HR policy for themselves out of pure necessity, because nobody else was ever going to do it for them, and because the alternative was simply chaos every single festival season, every single evening at the gambling table. Over generations, these networks spread. By the later Edo period, versions of the tekia and bakudo existed in most major cities and along most major roads across Japan. Each one was small, each one was local, each one answered only to its own leadership with no central command tying them together in any meaningful way. but each one carried the same basic instinct passed down through the trade itself. Where the law does not reach, you build something of your own that can. It's tempting to imagine this as some grand criminal design unfolding slowly across the centuries, but the truth is much less dramatic and, frankly, much more relatable. This wasn't ambition, it was logistics. It was the same impulse that makes any group of people, denied a functioning system by the people meant to provide one, quietly build a smaller, better functioning system among themselves instead. The Tekia wanted stalls that didn't get stolen out from under them. The Bakudo wanted debts that actually got paid. Neither group was thinking about the 20th century. Neither group could have imagined what their small, local solution to a small, local problem was eventually going to become. And once you have two separate industries, operating for generations along completely parallel tracks, both arriving at hierarchy and loyalty as the answer to lawlessness, you have to ask what they actually called themselves once they'd built it. Because the name they eventually chose says almost everything about how these people understood their own place in the world. And it's considerably less flattering than you might expect from an organization that would go on to command genuine national power. There's another layer to this founding story worth sitting with, because it explains why these particular solutions turned out to be so durable, rather than simply collapsing the moment conditions changed. A private system of law only survives if the people living under it actually believe enforcement will be consistent, predictable, and fair enough to trust over a competing option, which in this case was simply chaos. The Tekia couldn't afford to have their internal rulings ignored by senior members whenever it suited them, because the entire value of the system depended on everyone genuinely believing the rules applied evenly. The same was true, arguably even more so, for the Bakudo, since gambling debts are exactly the kind of obligation that tends to evaporate the moment enforcement looks the least bit optional. Compare this to any modern group project where the rules exist only on paper. You've almost certainly been part of one. Everyone nods along when the plan gets outlined, and then somehow, the person who agreed to handle the difficult part simply doesn't, and there's no actual mechanism forcing accountability beyond mild disappointment at the next meeting. The Tekia and Bakudo solved this problem the hard way, through genuine consequences consistently applied, which is precisely why their internal order held together for centuries, while so many looser modern arrangements barely survive a single semester. It's also worth noting how differently these early networks handled disputes compared to how you might picture organized crime settling disagreements. This wasn't primarily about intimidation for its own sake. It was fundamentally about maintaining a functioning marketplace, literally, in the case of the Tekia's festival stalls, and financially, in the case of the Bakudo's gambling debts. Violence was expensive, disruptive, and bad for repeat business, whether that business was selling questionable tonics or running a dice table. A festival vendor who got a reputation for settling every dispute through fists would find fewer merchants willing to set up beside him the following year, and fewer customers willing to approach his stall at all. The incentive, from the very beginning, ran toward negotiation and consistent internal law, not toward chaos. This preference for order over disorder would echo forward through every single century this organization eventually spanned, all the way into its 20th century form. It's the reason later Yakuza groups would prefer formal truces to open warfare whenever possible, the reason they'd maintain visible offices rather than operating from complete secrecy, the reason an entire elaborate system of ritual and obligation would eventually develop to make loyalty verifiable rather than simply assumed. None of that started with any grand strategic vision. It started with peddlers trying to keep their festival stalls and gamblers trying to get their money back. The word Yakuza comes from a losing hand in an old card game called Oichokabu, where the goal was to draw cards adding up to 9. Draw an 8, a 9, and a 3, and your total ends in 0, the worst possible result, a hand worth precisely nothing at all. Yakuza 893, a losing hand worn as a name for the next 300 years. Sit with how unusual this actually is. Imagine naming your organization after your single worst possible outcome, on purpose, and then sticking with it for centuries, even as that organization grew wealthier and more powerful than almost anyone could have predicted. It would be a bit like a hedge fund calling itself Total Loss Capital on its very first day of trading, and then somehow still attracting investors for the next 10 generations, because everyone quietly understood the name wasn't really about the money at all. And that's the part worth understanding. The choice wasn't self-pity, and it wasn't an accident either. It was closer to a shrug. These were people who had already been told, quite clearly, exactly where they stood in the wider society around them, outside it, at the margins, tolerated at best. Taking a name that openly admitted as much, rather than one that puffed up their own importance with some grand title borrowed from warrior culture or noble lineage, was in its own strange way a kind of honesty. You'll notice modern organizations almost never do this. Nobody names their startup, Mediocre Quarterly Returns Incorporated, even on the rare occasion when the actual numbers would justify it completely. Corporate branding, whatever its many flaws, has never once been interested in truth for its own sake. But there's a second layer buried in this name that deserves attention too, because it tells you something about the culture growing up around these early networks. In the card game itself, the losing hand wasn't shameful exactly. It was simply the outcome nobody wanted, the hand you were dealt through no fault of your own, the bad luck that could fall on anyone at the table regardless of skill. Adopting that name suggests these early Tekia and Bakudo understood themselves less as villains and more as people who had drawn a bad hand in life, socially speaking, and had simply learned to live with the consequences, on their own terms, according to their own rules. Around this name and around this self-understanding grew something far more flattering than the name itself ever suggested, a myth about who these people actually were and what purpose they actually served in the communities around them. Myths like this rarely stay small. Once a group starts believing its own myth sincerely enough, generation after generation, that myth stops being a piece of internal marketing and starts behaving like an actual rulebook, shaping real decisions made by real people in real moments of crisis. This is worth pausing on because it explains a genuine puzzle at the center of this whole story. How does an organization built by society's outcasts end up, centuries later, with members willing to shorten their own fingers in apology, funerals that draw mourners from rival gangs, business cards handed out like any respectable company might do at a trade conference? None of that behavior makes sense if you assume this was simply a criminal gang from the beginning, motivated purely by greed and nothing else. It only makes sense once you understand that these people had constructed, out of genuine necessity, an entire internal culture, complete with its own values, its own heroes, its own sense of honor, and that culture needed a story to hold it together. The name gave them humility. The myth that followed gave them purpose. And together, these two things did more to sustain this organization across the centuries than any weapon or any threat of violence ever could have. It's also worth noting how differently this compares to how modern criminal organizations, or frankly modern corporations, tend to talk about themselves. Most institutions today spend enormous effort convincing the public and convincing their own employees that they are important, essential, even virtuous. Mission statements get workshopped for months. Values get printed on posters and hung in break rooms nobody reads carefully. The Tekia and Bakudo did something almost the opposite. They started from a position of admitted worthlessness and built their internal pride from the ground up, earned rather than declared. There is something almost old-fashioned about that approach, in a world where every company insists it is changing the world simply by selling slightly cheaper socks. None of this stayed confined to card games and street stalls forever, though. As Japan's economy began to shift and modernize, this small, self-contained culture of outcasts with their own private rulebook was about to be handed an opportunity nobody could have predicted centuries earlier, a chance to walk straight into the legitimate economy through a door that industrialization itself was about to open wide. There's a broader pattern worth noticing here too, because it says something about how organizations choose their founding stories more generally, and how rarely those choices get examined honestly. Most institutions, when they eventually write their own history, tend to smooth over the humble or uncomfortable parts. A modern company celebrating its anniversary will happily produce a polished video about visionary founders and bold early bets, and will very quietly skip over the years when the whole operation ran out of a garage with unpaid invoices piling up on a folding table. The Yakuza, in choosing and keeping a name that literally meant worthless hand, did something closer to the opposite. It kept the uncomfortable part front and center, generation after generation, rather than editing it out once respectability and wealth eventually arrived. This matters because names, once chosen, tend to outlive the reasons behind them, and they quietly shape how members think about their own place in the world for as long as the name survives. A soldier recruited into an organization called something grand and heroic tends to imagine himself as part of something noble from day one. A recruit joining an organization that openly named itself after a losing hand starts from a very different psychological position, an acceptance that he is already outside respectable society, with nothing further to lose by embracing that fact fully rather than pretending otherwise. That acceptance, oddly enough, may have made loyalty easier to demand later, since a man who has already accepted his outsider status has less invested in maintaining appearances that might otherwise compete with obligations to the organization itself. It's worth remembering, too, that this name persisted through every single transformation the organization underwent over the following 3 centuries. It persisted through the shift from street peddling into labor brokering. It persisted through the explosive post-war expansion into gambling, construction, and eventually national finance. Even at the absolute peak of Yamaguchigumi's wealth and influence in the 1980s, when its annual income rivaled major legitimate corporations, the organization and its members were still, technically, walking around under a name that meant nothing, that celebrated failure that had been chosen centuries earlier by people with far humbler ambitions than anything the organization eventually achieved. There's something almost stubbornly honest about that continuity, however uncomfortable the underlying history actually was. The myth that grew up around these early networks had a name of its own, Ninkyo, usually translated as chivalry. The story it told, repeated in countless variations across generations, was simple and appealing. These organizations protected ordinary townspeople from corrupt officials, abusive landlords, and predatory moneylenders who operated entirely within the law while causing just as much harm as anyone operating outside it. Less organized crime, in this telling, more community watch program with considerably worse boundaries and a much stricter dress code. Was this mostly exaggerated, polished carefully over generations, sometimes quite deliberately by the organizations themselves? Almost certainly, yes. A gambler who used his winnings to help a struggling farmer made for a far better story and a far more effective recruiting pitch than one who simply extracted whatever he could from whoever crossed his path. Stories like these tend to spread faster than the more mundane truth, and they tend to survive longer in the collective memory of a community, especially when the organization telling them has every incentive to keep the story alive. But here's where the exaggeration becomes almost beside the point, because the people inside the organization grew up genuinely believing this story about themselves. Recruits joining these networks weren't simply signing up for a paycheck or a life of easy crime. They were joining something they understood sincerely as a tradition of protecting the vulnerable, standing against corrupt authority, living by a code that ordinary, respectable society had somehow failed to uphold on its own. And a myth believed sincerely enough by the people living inside, it starts producing real, measurable behavior. Rules against theft from ordinary citizens, a strong preference for negotiation over open violence whenever a dispute could be settled that way instead. Elaborate, genuine respect extended even toward bitter enemies during moments like funerals, when the wider tradition mattered more than whatever conflict was currently unresolved. It's the same basic phenomenon behind why your own office still has a "We're like a family here" poster hanging in the break room, faded slightly at the corners, next to a coffee machine that hasn't worked properly since March. Nobody genuinely believes the poster reflects daily reality with perfect accuracy, but enough people act, at least some of the time, as though the sentiment behind it matters, and that's often sufficient to shape real behavior in small but meaningful ways. The difference, of course, is that Yakuza members were expected to take their version of the poster considerably more seriously than anyone in a modern office takes free pizza on a Friday afternoon. Nobody is shortening a finger over a missed team-building exercise. The Ninkyo myth also purchased something outside the organization that turned out to matter enormously over the following decades, a general public that regarded these groups with wariness rather than outright hostility. This distinction mattered more than it might initially sound like it should. A community that fears an organization completely will eventually mobilize against it, given enough provocation and enough time. A community that regards an organization with mixed feelings, some fear, yes, but also some grudging respect, some genuine gratitude passed down through family stories about a favor done generations earlier, tends to tolerate that organization's continued presence far longer than pure fear ever could sustain. For most of the 20th century, many ordinary Japanese citizens held exactly this kind of mixed view. Not enthusiastic support, certainly, but not the kind of united public outrage that forces a government into immediate, decisive action either. That kind of goodwill, cultivated carefully across generations through stories, festivals, quiet favors, and a carefully maintained public image, does not disappear overnight. As we'll see much later in this story, it took the Japanese government the better part of a century to finally unwind it, piece by piece, and even then, the unwinding happened slowly, legally, almost bureaucratically, rather than through any single dramatic confrontation. For now, though, this carefully cultivated self-image needed somewhere real to grow beyond street corners and gambling dens, and Japan's rapidly modernizing economy was about to hand these networks exactly that kind of opportunity, a legitimate industry, hungry for organized labor, with absolutely no interest in asking too many questions about where that organization and discipline had originally come from. It's worth pushing a little further on how exactly a myth like Ninkyo gets manufactured and sustained across so many generations, because the mechanics matter more than they might initially seem to. Stories about heroic gamblers helping struggling farmers didn't simply appear spontaneously out of nowhere. They circulated through exactly the same channels ordinary folklore always travels through: taverns, festivals, family conversations repeated at dinner tables, and eventually, once the technology existed, popular theater and film that found these outsider heroes irresistibly compelling as subject matter. Japanese popular culture across the 20th century produced an enormous body of films and stories built around exactly this romanticized image: sympathetic gamblers and peddlers standing up against corrupt officials, honoring an unwritten code that respectable society had somehow abandoned. These stories reached far more people than any recruiting pitch delivered in person ever could, and they did something recruiting pitches rarely manage. They made the audience actively want to believe the myth was true, because the alternative, a more mundane and considerably less flattering reality, was simply less satisfying to watch on a Saturday evening. This is worth comparing to how modern industries manage their own public image through popular media, because the mechanism is genuinely similar, even if the specific content differs enormously. An industry that manages to get itself portrayed sympathetically in popular entertainment gains something no advertising campaign could ever purchase directly: the sense that ordinary people arrived at a favorable opinion entirely on their own, through stories they simply enjoyed, rather than through anything resembling a deliberate persuasion campaign. Whether or not the Tekiya and Bakudo, and later the Yakuza itself, deliberately cultivated this cultural output, or whether storytellers simply found outsider antiheroes compelling on their own merits, the effect on public perception was identical either way, and it lasted for generations. There's a genuine irony buried in all of this worth sitting with before we move on. The myth of protecting the vulnerable coexisted, sometimes uncomfortably, with the organization's own internal hierarchy, which was built on obligation, deference, and a level of control over junior members that a genuinely chivalrous, freedom-loving folk hero would probably have found somewhat difficult to reconcile with his own legend. Myths rarely survive close inspection. What matters, for the purposes of this story, is simply that they didn't need to survive close inspection. They needed to survive at the level of general public sentiment, repeated at just enough dinner tables and shown in just enough films. And at that level, this particular myth performed remarkably well for the better part of a century. As Japan industrialized through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, these networks discovered something even better than gambling and street markets: a legitimate excuse to keep doing exactly what they already did, only now with an actual paycheck attached, and considerably less risk of a magistrate taking any real interest. Growing cities needed dockworkers to unload the cargo arriving in expanding ports. They needed construction crews to build the factories, railways, and housing that a rapidly modernizing nation required in enormous quantities, often on timelines that left very little room for careful hiring practices. This labor supply was often unpredictable and needed to be organized quickly. Companies needed reliable ways to source workers on short notice, sometimes in large numbers, sometimes for dangerous or physically demanding work that ordinary laborers might otherwise avoid if given a real choice. The Tekiya and Bakudo networks, with their existing structures of loyal, organized, disciplined men, slid naturally into this role of labor broker, acting as the crucial middlemen between companies desperate for workers and workers desperate for wages. Think of it as the world's least regulated staffing agency, minus the LinkedIn profile, minus the awkward outreach messages clogging your inbox every Tuesday morning, minus the recruiter who insists on calling instead of simply sending an email like a reasonable person. What it had instead was reliability. If a dock needed 40 men by sunrise to unload an unexpected shipment, an organization already practiced at managing loyal, disciplined groups could deliver 40 men by sunrise, no questions asked, no paperwork required, and a considerably more binding relationship with each of those workers than any modern staffing contract would ever attempt to establish. This arrangement gave these organizations something they had never quite possessed before, a genuine foothold inside the legitimate economy, decades before the post-war boom that most people associate with their eventual rise to real wealth and real power. A dockworkers organization controlling labor supply at a busy, growing port was, in a very real sense, already running a business that any respectable company of the era would have recognized and understood, even if the internal methods of enforcement, loyalty, and discipline underneath it remained entirely, uniquely their own. It was during this exact period, in the port city of Kobe, that a modest little labor and gambling outfit got its start. Founded in the early 20th century as a relatively unremarkable dockworkers organization, it controlled labor along a stretch of busy waterfront, unremarkable among dozens of similar local groups scattered across Japan's other rapidly growing port cities. If you had walked past its offices in those early years, you would have seen nothing to suggest this organization was about to become anything more significant than any of its many local competitors. Nobody watching this small, unremarkable dockworkers group could have guessed what it was about to become. It's a bit like glancing at a mid-sized regional courier company in 1912, watching men load small parcels onto horse-drawn carts, and having absolutely no idea that the same organization is going to be running half the country's deliveries 100 years later, with a logo everyone recognizes and a reputation that precedes it into every conversation. The seeds of enormous scale rarely announce themselves clearly at the moment they're planted. They simply sit there, unremarkable, waiting for the right conditions to arrive. Its name was Yamaguchi, and though absolutely no one could have known it at the time, this modest labor broker on the Kobe waterfront was about to receive exactly the kind of dramatic, unexpected opportunity that turns a small regional player into a national force almost overnight. That opportunity was not going to arrive gently. It was going to arrive in the form of total national collapse, and it was going to arrive within a single generation of the organization's founding. It's worth understanding just how central the concept of reliability actually was to this particular business model, because it explains why companies kept returning to these labor brokers year after year despite having, at least on paper, more respectable alternatives available. A construction firm or a shipping company operating on a tight deadline could not afford uncertainty about whether promised workers would actually show up ready to perform demanding physical labor. An informal day labor market, without any organizing structure behind it, tended to produce exactly this kind of uncertainty. Workers who didn't show, workers who showed up but lacked any real discipline or coordination, disputes over pay that disrupted an entire crew's productivity in the middle of an urgent project. An organization already practiced, through generations of internal discipline built around obligation and hierarchy, at delivering coordinated groups of loyal, reliable men solved this problem in a way few competitors could easily replicate. If you were a factory owner or a shipping company manager in early 20th century, Japan facing a sudden labor shortage, the calculation was fairly straightforward, even if you harbored some private discomfort about exactly who you were dealing with. You needed 40 reliable men by morning. One option could reliably deliver 40 reliable men by morning. The other options could not make that same promise with any real confidence. Business, across nearly every industry and nearly every era of human history, tends to reward whoever can actually deliver on a promise, regardless of how uncomfortable the underlying relationship might otherwise appear from the outside. This dynamic would repeat itself again and again throughout this organization's history, in industry after industry, precisely because it wasn't really about any single business sector at all. It was about a genuinely transferable competency, the ability to organize disciplined groups of men and guarantee their reliable performance, built up over generations of internal ritual, obligation, and hierarchy that had originally developed for entirely different reasons, back when the only stakes involved were a festival stall or a gambling debt. That same underlying competency would prove valuable at the docks, valuable in construction, and eventually valuable in ways that stretched the definition of labor considerably further than anyone in the organization's earliest days could possibly have imagined. There's a further wrinkle worth exploring here, because the relationship between these labor brokers and the companies that hired them wasn't purely transactional in the way a simple staffing arrangement might suggest. Over time, genuine familiarity developed between specific brokers and specific companies, familiarity that shaped not just who got hired for a given project, but which projects got prioritized when demand for labor exceeded what any single broker could supply on a given morning. A company with an established, trusted relationship might find its urgent labor needs met first, ahead of a newer or less familiar client, simply because reputation and accumulated trust functioned as their own kind of currency within this particular market, exactly as they did everywhere else this organization operated. This produced something resembling genuine business loyalty, running in both directions, well before either party would have used a term like that to describe it. Companies that treated their labor brokers fairly, paying promptly and treating workers reasonably, tended to receive more reliable service over time. Brokers who consistently delivered quality, disciplined labor tended to retain valuable long-term clients rather than losing them to competitors. It's a dynamic any modern business consultant would recognize instantly, dressed up in language about vendor relationships and account management, even though the underlying reality here involved an entirely different kind of vendor than most consultants have in mind when they use those particular terms. That opportunity arrived in 1945, and it came in the form of total collapse across every institution most citizens had relied on for their entire lives. Japan's government, discredited by the war it had just lost, could barely function in the immediate aftermath. Basic distribution systems for food, fuel, and medicine broke down almost entirely across the country, city by city, region by region, leaving ordinary households genuinely uncertain about where their next meal was coming from. Black markets sprang up almost immediately in every major city to fill this catastrophic gap, selling rice smuggled from rural areas, cigarettes and chocolate liberated from American occupation supply chains, medicine that had somehow found its way outside official channels entirely. None of this trade was being managed by anyone official, because there genuinely was no functioning, anyone official left standing to manage it. The police force itself was disorganized, chronically underfunded, and in many neighborhoods barely operating at all, its officers dealing with their own families' hunger and displacement just like everyone else around them. The Tekia and Bakudo networks, already fluent after centuries of practice in operating entirely outside official structures, stepped into this enormous vacuum almost overnight and grew explosively as a direct and immediate result. This wasn't some slow, careful, multi-decade expansion carried out with patience and long-term strategic planning. This was rapid, opportunistic growth into a genuine emergency, the kind of growth that only happens when an existing organization already has exactly the right skills, exactly the right structure, and exactly the right reputation sitting ready the very moment an unprecedented opportunity presents itself. It was in this exact environment that the small Kobe-based Yamaguchi-gumi began its transformation from a modest local labor broker into something dramatically larger and more ambitious. Under new post-war leadership, the organization expanded aggressively, absorbing smaller rival groups that lacked either the resources or the will to resist a much larger, much better organized competitor. It extended its reach into new cities entirely, cities where it had never previously operated, and it diversified far beyond its original waterfront labor business into gambling, black market trade, real estate, and eventually into forms of business nobody in 1945 could have reasonably predicted. Somewhere, a modern startup founder reading about this exact moment is taking uncomfortable notes on precisely how fast an organization can scale when there's genuinely no competition worth mentioning, genuinely no regulatory oversight to slow anything down, and an entire population desperately hungry for exactly the services you happen to already know how to provide reliably. It is, in its own strange way, close to the ideal market conditions any ambitious entrepreneur could ever hope for, minus the small detail that the entire country had just been devastated by war to create them. Within a few decades of this explosive post-war expansion, Yamaguchi-gumi had grown into the largest Yakuza syndicate in the entire country, with a presence stretching across most major cities and a level of accumulated wealth that, in certain years, genuinely rivaled or exceeded major legitimate corporations operating in the same national economy. Its rise mirrors, almost exactly, the pattern established 2 centuries earlier by the Tekia and Bakudo in their own much smaller way. A collapse in official order, followed immediately by the rapid, confident growth of an unofficial one, built by people already deeply practiced at operating comfortably in the space between the two. By the 1950s, what had once been a scattering of local peddler guilds and small gambling networks had become something with real, formalized rules, clearly defined ranks, and an internal chain of command that your own current employer, whoever that happens to be, would frankly envy for its remarkable clarity and consistency across every single branch. Understanding that internal structure in genuine detail is essential to understanding why this organization endured for as long as it eventually did, so that's exactly where we need to turn our attention next. It's worth pausing to consider just how unusual this speed of expansion actually was, even by the standards of organizations that thrive during moments of genuine national crisis. Most institutions, even ambitious ones, need years to establish trust, build reputation, and develop the internal systems necessary to manage rapid growth without simply falling apart under their own weight. Yamaguchi-gumi and organizations like it scattered across the country had a substantial head start on all 3 fronts simultaneously. Trust had already been built through generations of consistent internal dealing, long before the war ever began. Reputation had already been established, at least within certain communities, through the accumulated cultural weight of the Ninkyo myth. And the internal systems for managing a rapidly growing organization, the hierarchy, the obligation structure, the rituals binding senior and junior members together, had already been refined and tested over centuries of prior operation, long before anyone needed to apply them at this dramatically larger scale. What the post-war chaos provided wasn't the organizational capability itself. That capability had already existed, quietly, for generations. What the post-war chaos provided was simply an unprecedented opportunity to deploy that existing capability at a scale nobody within the organization had previously imagined possible. It's the difference between a company that suddenly discovers a brilliant new strategy overnight and a company that had already perfected a strategy years earlier and simply happened to be sitting exactly where an enormous, unexpected market opportunity finally opened up in front of it. The second scenario tends to produce considerably faster, considerably more durable growth, precisely because there's no learning curve slowing anything down. Everyone involved already knew exactly how to do this. They simply hadn't previously had the opportunity to do it at national scale. This helps explain something that might otherwise seem puzzling about the pace of Yamaguchi-gumi's post-war rise. An organization expanding this rapidly, absorbing this many smaller rivals in such a short span of years, might reasonably be expected to experience serious internal growing pains, disputes over territory among newly absorbed groups, inconsistency in how rules got enforced across a rapidly expanding network. Some of this friction certainly did occur. But the underlying structure proved remarkably capable of absorbing new territory without collapsing under the strain, precisely because that structure had already been tested and refined for generations before this particular moment of rapid expansion ever arrived. It's also worth understanding just how quickly information about which organizations could reliably deliver on their promises spread through a devastated, chaotic post-war society desperate for exactly that kind of reliability in nearly every part of daily life. In a period when official institutions had largely failed to deliver basic necessities consistently, word of mouth about which unofficial networks actually kept their word traveled remarkably fast, through neighborhoods, through workplaces, through the simple, urgent daily conversations people have when trying to figure out where their next meal or their next job is actually going to come from. This meant that early success bred further success at a genuinely accelerated pace, well beyond what careful long-term strategic planning alone could have produced. An organization that successfully delivered black market rice to one neighborhood earned the kind of reputation that brought in customers and potential recruits from neighboring areas almost immediately, without any deliberate marketing effort required. Word of mouth, in a society this hungry for reliability, functioned as an almost unstoppable growth engine, and Yamaguchi-gumi, along with several other rapidly expanding organizations across the country, benefited enormously from exactly this dynamic during the critical years immediately following the war's end. At the very top of this structure sits the oyabun, literally, father role. Below him sit the kabun, child role, and the relationship binding these two positions together is modeled quite deliberately on the bond between parent and child, rather than on anything resembling an ordinary employer and employee relationship, as we would understand it today. This wasn't a loose metaphor used casually in conversation. It was a formal, structural understanding, reinforced through ceremony, that shaped how members were expected to think about their entire lives from the moment they joined. There's an actual ceremony marking this transition, called the Sakazuki, an exchange of sake cups lifted directly from the language and symbolism of wedding and adoption rituals already deeply familiar to everyone present in the room. The ceremony itself was simple in its physical form, cups exchanged, sake shared, a few formal words spoken, but it was taken with genuine, lifelong seriousness by everyone involved. Once you had shared that cup with your oyabun, the bond was expected to last your entire life. There was no probationary period, after which you might quietly decide the arrangement wasn't working out after all. There is no 2 weeks' notice in this world. There is no exit interview where a slightly awkward HR representative asks what the organization could have done differently to retain you. Your onboarding here is, frankly, a great deal more binding than your current employer's non-compete clause, and considerably harder to negotiate your way out of once you've actually signed on, metaphorically speaking, by lifting that shared cup to your lips. Beneath the oyabun, the roles branch outward into positions that, structurally, map almost exactly onto any large company's organizational chart, if you squint slightly and ignore a few of the more colorful details. Underbosses manage territory and business on behalf of the boss, overseeing daily operations across a district or a specific line of business, essentially functioning as regional managers with considerably more personal authority over their staff than any modern regional manager would ever be granted. Advisors, typically older members whose judgment had been thoroughly tested across many years of service, were consulted on major disputes and significant decisions, operating as something between a legal department and a council of elders, minus the paperwork and minus the billable hours. Treasurers managed genuinely considerable sums of money flowing through gambling operations, loan collection, and an increasingly sophisticated web of legitimate-seeming business fronts, a role demanding both absolute trust and genuine financial competence in equal measure. This was an accounting department that, notably, never once faced an external audit from anyone outside the organization's own carefully maintained hierarchy, which either sounds like a tremendous relief or a genuine occupational hazard, depending entirely on your current relationship with your own company's finance team. And then, right at the very bottom of this entire structure, sat the newest members, and their position deserves particular attention because it illustrates something genuinely important about how the whole system managed to sustain itself, generation after generation, without collapsing under its own weight. A new recruit typically spent his first several years doing precisely nothing important in the grand scheme of the organization's business: cleaning the office, running small errands across town, answering telephones and taking careful messages, observing senior members quietly at work without being given any meaningful responsibility of his own to manage. If this sounds suspiciously familiar, like every entry-level job you've personally ever held, congratulations, you've just identified one of the oldest and most durable management strategies in the entire history of organized human labor. Make new people prove, through sustained boredom and menial tasks, that they'll actually stick around before you hand them anything genuinely worth stealing, or anything genuinely capable of damaging the organization if handled carelessly. This extended, deliberately unglamorous apprenticeship filtered out anyone chasing quick money or easy status, anyone unwilling to commit for the genuine long haul required. It also gave senior members years of quiet, patient observation, plenty of time to judge a recruit's discretion, his temperament under real pressure, his fundamental character, before extending any real trust or meaningful responsibility toward him. An organization that depends entirely on absolute, unwavering loyalty simply cannot afford to extend that loyalty carelessly or too quickly. This slow, patient filtering process, uncomfortable as it may have been for the young men living through it, was precisely how the organization protected itself against betrayal, against incompetence, against the kind of costly mistakes that a hastily promoted, insufficiently vetted member might eventually cause. Every single senior figure within this hierarchy had, at some earlier point in his own life, spent years cleaning that same office, running those same tedious errands, quietly proving himself worthy of the trust he would eventually receive. This is worth comparing, one more time, to your own working life, because the parallel really does run deeper than it might first appear. Most modern organizations claim to value loyalty and long-term commitment from their employees, print inspiring language about it in their recruitment materials, discuss it earnestly during annual reviews. Yet very few modern organizations actually build in a multi-year period, specifically designed to test that loyalty before extending real trust and real responsibility in return. The Yakuza, whatever else you might say about it, was remarkably consistent and remarkably patient about this particular principle, generation after generation, decade after decade, in a way that would strike most modern management consultants as either impressively disciplined or slightly excessive, depending entirely on how many years they've personally spent waiting for a promotion that never seemed to arrive on schedule. It's worth spending a moment on just how deliberately this apprenticeship period was designed to produce loyalty rather than simply resentment, because on paper, years of unpaid or minimally paid menial labor sounds like exactly the kind of arrangement that would drive away anyone with genuine ambition. The difference lay in what came after. A recruit who successfully endured this period wasn't simply released into an ordinary job with an ordinary salary. He was welcomed formally and ceremonially into a hierarchy that promised genuine advancement, genuine protection, and genuine status within a wider community that respected the structure he had just proven himself worthy of joining. This is worth comparing honestly to how modern organizations attempt, usually far less successfully, to build similar loyalty through years of underpaid entry-level work. Plenty of industries today expect new employees to spend years in unglamorous, poorly compensated positions before receiving any real advancement. The traditional professional apprenticeship model found in law, medicine, finance, and countless skilled trades. The crucial difference is what waits at the end of that apprenticeship. A modern junior employee enduring years of thankless work is often promised advancement that may or may not actually materialize, dependent on market conditions, company performance, or simple corporate reshuffling, entirely outside anyone's individual control. The Kaban completing his own apprenticeship within this hierarchy received something considerably more concrete: formal acknowledgement through ceremony, a defined position within an established structure, and a relationship of mutual obligation that, whatever its other flaws, was not going to simply evaporate during the next round of corporate restructuring. This distinction helps explain why the system sustained itself across so many generations without the kind of chronic turnover that plagues industries relying on similarly unglamorous entry-level labor today. People will tolerate years of difficult, unrewarding work if they genuinely believe something durable and meaningful waits on the other side of it. The Oyabun-Kaban relationship, whatever moral judgment you might reasonably form about the organization built around it, offered exactly that kind of durable promise, backed by centuries of consistent tradition, demonstrating that the promise had, in fact, generally been honored for those who came before. Two competing ideas governed behavior at every single level of this entire hierarchy, from the newest recruit cleaning the office floor to the most senior Oyabun overseeing an entire regional network. Jiri, a deep sense of duty and obligation, and Ninjo, ordinary human feeling and personal preference. In the culture cultivated carefully within this organization, Jiri was expected to win out over Ninjo in almost every circumstance a member might reasonably encounter, no matter how personally uncomfortable that expectation might become in any given moment. A member might be asked to quietly absorb blame for another man's genuine mistake, protecting a more senior figure from consequences that would otherwise fall squarely on his shoulders. He might be expected to endure real hardship without visible complaint, simply because the entire stability of the organization's structure depended on that particular obligation being honored without hesitation, without negotiation, without the kind of quiet resentment that might eventually poison the loyalty holding everything together. This wasn't an occasional expectation reserved for extreme circumstances. It was the baseline standard against which every member's character was continuously, quietly measured by everyone around him. There's an actual formal tradition connected to this culture of obligation that tends to capture more outside attention than almost anything else associated with this organization. Yubitsum, the deliberate shortening of one's own finger as an act of atonement for a genuinely serious failure. Contrary to how this practice is sometimes portrayed in popular imagination, it was rarely imposed directly by a boss as a form of punishment handed down from above. Far more often, it was offered voluntarily by the member himself, a visible, permanent, unmistakable way of demonstrating that he genuinely understood the gravity of his error and accepted full, personal responsibility for it, without requiring the organization to resort to unpredictable, escalating violence simply to maintain internal discipline among its ranks. It's an extreme version, admittedly a deeply unsettling one from any modern perspective, of something every single workplace secretly wants from its employees, but almost never actually receives in practice. Visible, permanent, undeniable accountability for genuine mistakes, offered voluntarily and immediately, instead of quietly hoping nobody circles back around to ask uncomfortable questions about what exactly went wrong and whose responsibility it ultimately was. Most companies faced with an equivalent failure settle for a written warning filed quietly in a personnel folder, followed by one deeply uncomfortable meeting with a human resources representative who would clearly rather be handling literally any other item on their calendar that particular afternoon. The comparison sounds almost darkly comic when placed side by side like this, and in some ways it genuinely is. But it also reveals something real and worth taking seriously about how differently this organization approached the entire concept of failure compared to how most modern institutions handle it. Failure within this system was never something to be quietly buried, minimized, or blamed on external circumstances beyond anyone's reasonable control. It was something to be owned immediately, visibly, and permanently, in a way that left absolutely no room for ambiguity about who was responsible and what price they were personally willing to pay for it. This entire elaborate system of obligation, sacrifice, and personal accountability only functions correctly, though if everyone within the organization, and increasingly everyone outside it as well, can actually see clearly who owes exactly what to whom at any given moment. A private, hidden hierarchy of debt and obligation is fragile precisely because nobody outside the innermost circle can verify whether it's being honored consistently or not. Which brings us to one of the genuinely strangest and most counterintuitive features of this entire organization across its long history. Rather than hiding in the shadows the way popular imagination tends to assume, it advertised itself, quite openly, almost proudly, to the wider society surrounding it. There's a further dimension to this culture of obligation worth examining, because it explains how the organization managed disputes between members without constantly resorting to the kind of escalating violence that would have made long-term stability impossible. When Jiri consistently outweighed Ninjo, disagreements between members tended to get resolved through appeals to duty and established hierarchy, rather than through raw emotional confrontation. If two members disagreed about how a particular task should be handled, the dispute wasn't ultimately settled by whoever argued more forcefully or felt more strongly about being right. It was settled by appealing upward through the established chain of obligation to whichever senior figure held legitimate authority over the matter, and once that figure rendered a decision, Jiri demanded the dispute end there, regardless of how either party personally felt about the outcome. This produced something genuinely valuable for an organization operating at the scale this one eventually reached. A built-in mechanism for resolving internal conflict that didn't depend on personal charisma, physical intimidation, or sheer force of personality to actually function. A junior member frustrated with a decision handed down from above couldn't simply escalate the disagreement through personal confrontation, because doing so would violate the very obligation structure his entire position within the organization depended on. The dispute resolution mechanism was, in this sense, built directly into the culture itself, rather than requiring constant active enforcement from above. Compare this to how disagreements tend to play out in organizations lacking this kind of deeply internalized cultural mechanism. Without a shared, genuinely believed framework for resolving disputes, disagreements tend to escalate based on whoever has more raw power in a given moment, which produces exactly the kind of unpredictable, destabilizing conflict this organization spent centuries trying to avoid. The genius of building jiri so deeply into the culture, reinforced through ceremony, through shared history, through stories passed down across generations, was that it made internal stability nearly automatic, requiring far less constant active management than a purely hierarchical structure lacking this deeper cultural buy-in ever could have achieved on its own. There's one more dimension to this culture of duty worth examining, because it shaped not just how disputes got resolved, but how members understood the entire arc of their working lives within the organization. Jiri wasn't experienced as a single, isolated demand imposed occasionally during moments of crisis. It was woven into the everyday texture of ordinary daily life within the organization, shaping small decisions just as thoroughly as it shaped dramatic ones. A member deciding how to greet a senior figure, how to handle a minor disagreement with a colleague, how much personal sacrifice to accept during a difficult period for the organization. All of these ordinary decisions were filtered through the same underlying framework of duty and obligation that governed the organization's biggest, most consequential moments. This constant, everyday reinforcement is precisely what made the system so durable across so many decades. A code of conduct invoked only during rare, dramatic emergencies tends to feel abstract and easily forgotten during ordinary daily life. A code of conduct woven into thousands of small daily decisions, reinforced continuously through years of lived experience, becomes something closer to genuine instinct, requiring far less conscious effort to maintain once it had been sufficiently internalized during those long early years of apprenticeship described earlier in this story. What's strangest of all, to modern ears listening to this story unfold, is simply how openly this entire operation ran, generation after generation, in plain view of the society it operated within. Established organizations often kept offices with actual nameplates mounted beside the door, indistinguishable at a glance from any other respectable local business. Senior members distributed business cards during meetings, exchanging them with the same formal courtesy any legitimate professional might extend to a new contact at an industry gathering. Some organizations even published their own internal newsletters, covering organizational news, leadership announcements, and other updates relevant to members scattered across different cities and different branches of the same wider network. This openness was not recklessness, and it was certainly not the product of arrogance or carelessness on the part of the organizations involved. It served a genuinely important practical function that becomes obvious once you think through the alternative. A visible, clearly identifiable organization can negotiate territory with a rival far more easily and far more efficiently than an anonymous one ever could. If you don't know precisely who controls a particular district, precisely who you'd need to approach to resolve a dispute, precisely whose reputation is on the line if an agreement gets broken, you cannot negotiate anything at all. You can only guess, and guessing tends to escalate into exactly the kind of unpredictable violence this whole elaborate system of visibility and ritual was specifically designed to avoid in the first place. Which means somewhere in mid-20th century Japan, a senior Yakuza figure is handing a carefully printed business card to another senior Yakuza figure at what is, functionally, a networking event indistinguishable in its basic mechanics from any trade association dinner happening in any respectable industry that same evening. Names are exchanged, titles are noted. Territories are discussed with the same careful, formal courtesy you might expect between two competing regional sales directors comparing notes over drinks, and nobody in that particular room finds any part of this remotely unusual, because within their own world, it wasn't unusual at all. It was simply how serious, established organizations conducted their serious, established business. Visibility within this world wasn't a strategic mistake waiting to be exploited by outside authorities. It was, for a very long time, the entire point of how the organization chose to operate. The same instinct that made the old Tekia guilds mark out their festival territory clearly enough that nobody had to guess whose corner they had accidentally wandered into centuries earlier, had scaled up dramatically into something resembling formal corporate identity. Offices announced themselves. Leadership structures were, within reasonable limits, publicly known. Reputation itself became a kind of currency, carefully protected and carefully displayed, precisely because a reputation nobody could verify was a reputation worth nothing at all in negotiations with rivals who needed to trust that agreements, once made, would actually be honored. It's worth pausing here to notice how this openness also shaped the wider public's relationship with these organizations across the decades. An organization operating entirely in secret, hidden from public view, tends to provoke fear precisely because nobody can predict its behavior or verify its intentions. An organization operating openly, with recognizable offices and recognizable leadership, becomes, whether anyone likes it or not, a known quantity within the community. Neighbors knew which building belonged to which group. Local shopkeepers knew who to approach if a dispute needed resolving quickly, outside the slow machinery of the official legal system. This visibility, uncomfortable as it might seem from the outside, actually reduced a certain kind of unpredictable danger that a fully anonymous criminal network would otherwise have introduced into everyday neighborhood life. None of this should suggest that visibility made these organizations harmless, or that openly displayed nameplates somehow transformed genuinely dangerous enterprises into something purely civic-minded. But it does explain a genuine puzzle that trips up a lot of people encountering this history for the first time. How could an organization this large, this wealthy, this deeply embedded in ordinary economic life, operate for so long without being immediately and decisively shut down by the authorities the moment its existence became known? Part of the answer, as we'll see clearly in later chapters, involves decades of ambiguous government tolerance. But another part of the answer is simply this: an organization operating openly, following its own internally consistent rules, negotiating disputes through recognizable channels, was, in a strange way, easier for the wider society around it to coexist with than a completely hidden, completely unpredictable network would ever have been. But offices and business cards and internal newsletters only get an organization so far once it has grown from a handful of local groups into hundreds of them, scattered across an entire country, each one technically independent, each one answering to its own local leadership, while somehow remaining connected to a much larger whole. At that kind of scale, you need something considerably more sophisticated than a single company with a single chain of command running cleanly from the very top down to the very bottom. You need something closer to a franchise system. And that, as it turns out, is precisely what this organization had quietly, almost accidentally, become. This visibility strategy also created something worth examining more carefully: a genuine reputational economy running parallel to, and often intertwined with, the organization's actual financial economy. A group standing within this world depended not just on its wealth or its territory, but on its accumulated reputation for honoring agreements, for treating rivals fairly during negotiations, for maintaining internal discipline consistently enough that outsiders could trust what a member told them on behalf of his organization. This reputation, once established, became genuinely valuable in its own right, functioning almost like a form of currency that could be spent during difficult negotiations or leveraged to avoid costly conflicts that a less reputable organization might have been forced into. Building this kind of reputation took decades, sometimes generations, of consistent behavior. Losing it could happen considerably faster, through a single broken agreement or a single act of betrayal that spread quickly through a community built around exactly this kind of word-of-mouth trust. This created a genuine incentive for organizations to actually honor the codes they claimed to follow, not simply out of abstract moral commitment, but because reputation, once damaged, was extraordinarily costly to rebuild in a world where every other organization was constantly, quietly evaluating whether you could still be trusted to keep your word. It's worth noting how this compares to reputation management in more conventional modern business contexts, where a company's brand and public trust function in remarkably similar ways, built slowly over years of consistent behavior, and capable of collapsing rapidly following a single well-publicized scandal. The mechanics are nearly identical, even though the underlying business being conducted could hardly be more different. Trust, once you strip away the specific industry involved, tends to follow the same basic economic logic everywhere: expensive to build, valuable to maintain, and devastating to lose all at once. At the largest scale this organization ever reached, an outfit like the Yamaguchi-gumi wasn't really operating as one single company with one clean chain of command, the way outsiders often imagined it from the outside looking in. It was structured far more like a franchise system, closer in its underlying mechanics to how a major restaurant chain organizes hundreds of individually owned and operated locations, than to how a traditional corporation manages its various departments from a single central headquarters. Hundreds of semi-independent local groups, each led by its own boss, each running its own territory and its own day-to-day business decisions, largely without direct interference from above, each paying a negotiated cut of its earnings upward to the central organization in exchange for two very specific, very valuable things. The first was protection, in the genuine sense that the wider network's accumulated reputation and resources stood firmly behind any individual local group in the event of a serious dispute with a rival organization. A small local group facing pressure from a larger, more aggressive rival could invoke the full weight of the larger name behind it, transforming what might otherwise be an unequal, dangerous confrontation into something considerably more balanced, simply because everyone involved understood exactly what invoking that larger name actually meant in practical terms. The second thing purchased through this upward payment was prestige, plain and simple. Affiliation with a large, widely respected name carried genuine, tangible value in negotiations with rivals, in relationships with local businesses, and even, at certain points across this long history, in dealings with local police forces who understood exactly which organizations commanded enough influence to be worth treating carefully. This is, structurally speaking, almost identical to how a fast food franchise operates in the modern economy, right down to the basic mechanics of local autonomy, combined with centralized branding and centralized standards. A franchise owner running an individual restaurant location makes countless day-to-day decisions independently, hires his own staff, manages his own daily operations, while still paying a percentage of revenue upward to corporate headquarters in exchange for brand recognition, supply chain support, and a recognizable name that customers already trust before they've even walked through the door. The quarterly performance review under this particular franchise system, admittedly, carried somewhat higher stakes than a slightly disappointing customer satisfaction survey filed after a mediocre drive-through experience. And this franchised, distributed structure explains something genuinely important about why this organization proved so remarkably resilient across the decades, surviving wave after wave of police pressure that would have completely destroyed a more centralized criminal enterprise. Arresting any single boss, even a very senior, very influential one, occupying a genuinely important position within the wider hierarchy, barely dented the network as a whole in any lasting, structurally meaningful way. Cut off one franchise location entirely, remove its leadership completely, and the rest of the chain simply kept serving its existing customers without missing so much as a single beat, because authority itself was never concentrated in one vulnerable central point to begin with. It was deliberately, systematically distributed across hundreds of these semi-independent nodes, each one capable of continuing operations largely independently of whatever happened to any other single node elsewhere in the country. This explains why, across nearly a full century of sustained legal pressure, individual raids and individual arrests kept happening with real regularity, kept generating real headlines in Japanese newspapers, kept representing genuine short-term victories for whichever police unit happened to be responsible for that particular case. And yet the wider organization kept right on operating, largely unaffected in any structural sense by the loss of any single local leader, no matter how senior or how important he might have personally seemed at the moment of his arrest. A raid on one office could feel, from the perspective of the police officers involved, like a genuinely significant achievement worth real celebration. From the perspective of the organization as a whole, spread across hundreds of similar offices in hundreds of similar cities, it looked considerably more like closing a single underperforming branch location out of an enormous, geographically dispersed franchise network that simply continued operating everywhere else, entirely unaffected by that particular local setback. Now that you understand the basic shape of this company, the franchise structure holding it all together across decades of sustained pressure, it's worth asking the genuinely obvious follow-up question. What was this vast, distributed network actually selling, day after day, to generate the enormous sums of money flowing upward through this entire structure? Because the answer starts with the oldest business in the entire family's long history, tracing directly back to those original highway gamblers, and it never really went away, not even as the organization grew into industries its founders could never have imagined. This franchise structure also produced something worth understanding about how disputes were managed between the various semi-independent branches of the same wider organization, because internal competition between local groups affiliated with the same larger name was a genuine, recurring challenge that had to be managed carefully to avoid undermining the entire system's stability. Two local groups, both nominally part of the same larger federation, might still find themselves in genuine competition over adjacent territory, over control of a particular business opportunity, over recruiting the same promising young members into their respective ranks. The central leadership of an organization like Yamaguchi couldn't simply dictate every local decision from above without undermining the very autonomy that made the franchise model function efficiently in the first place. Instead, disputes of this kind typically got resolved through the same negotiated, ceremony-heavy process used to manage disputes between entirely separate organizations, just conducted internally, among branches technically operating under the same larger banner. This required genuine diplomatic skill from senior leadership, balancing the need to maintain overall unity against the practical reality that dozens, eventually hundreds, of local groups each had their own legitimate interests that didn't always perfectly align with each other. It's worth comparing this to how any large modern franchise operation manages tension between individual locations competing for the same regional customer base, or how a large corporation manages competition between different internal divisions technically working toward the same overall company goals, but practically competing for the same limited budget and the same organizational attention. The underlying challenge is remarkably similar. How do you maintain enough central coordination to preserve the benefits of scale, while preserving enough local autonomy that individual branches remain genuinely motivated and genuinely responsive to their own particular circumstances? This organization, through centuries of accumulated practice managing exactly this tension, generally managed it more successfully than most modern franchise operations, if only because the consequences of failing to manage it well were considerably more severe than a disappointing quarterly earnings call. Gambling was the original family business, the very first source of income tracing directly back to the Bakudo networks running dice games along Japan's highways many generations earlier, long before any of this had grown into anything resembling a formal organization at all. In the 20th century, this foundational connection to gambling evolved into a deep, sustained relationship with pachinko, the pinball-style gambling machines that became an absolutely inescapable fixture of Japanese city life, found on nearly every commercial street in every major urban center across the country. Pachinko itself occupied a peculiar, legally ambiguous space within Japanese law, technically operating under regulations that avoided classifying it as straightforward gambling, even though the basic mechanics involved players exchanging money for a chance at winning more money back. Yakuza-linked involvement in the operation, financing, and especially the informal exchange of winnings for actual cash, remained a significant and remarkably steady source of income across many decades, largely because this particular legal ambiguity created exactly the kind of gray area these organizations had always specialized in occupying comfortably. Loan sharking filled the very next gap in this expanding business portfolio, and it's worth understanding that this was a gap the formal banking system left wide open through its own institutional caution, rather than through any particular failing unique to Japan. Banks throughout much of the 20th century tended to be slow, methodical, and often deeply reluctant to extend credit quickly to small businesses or ordinary households facing sudden, urgent financial difficulty. If you needed fast money to cover an unexpected expense, and your local bank wanted 3 weeks of paperwork alongside a credit history stretching back further than your family had probably kept detailed records, someone else was always readily available to skip the paperwork entirely, for a price your future self would inevitably find considerably less charming than your desperate present self did in that particular moment of need. This role as an informal, fast-moving lender positioned Yakuza-affiliated figures in a great many ordinary neighborhoods across the country as something considerably closer to informal arbiters of everyday financial disputes than to the simple, one-dimensional criminal's popular imagination often reduces them to. A shopkeeper struggling with an unpaid debt owed by a difficult customer a landlord dealing with months of unpaid rent from a tenant who had genuinely fallen on hard times, a small business owner needing quick capital just to survive one particularly slow month before the next season's revenue arrived. All of these were, in various times and various places across Japan, situations where a Yakuza-linked figure might reasonably step in and resolve matters considerably faster than any official channel could realistically manage, given how slowly Japan's formal civil courts tended to move through even relatively straightforward financial disputes. It's the exact same underlying pattern the Tekia and Bakudo had established centuries earlier during their own much smaller, much more localized operations along the highways and at the festival grounds, just wearing a considerably nicer suit now, operating out of an actual office with a nameplate rather than a makeshift stall at a passing festival. Wherever the official system moved too slowly, or simply declined to move at all, this organization was already there, quietly holding the door open, ready to provide exactly the service the formal system had failed to deliver, at exactly the moment ordinary people needed it most, for a price that reflected both the genuine convenience provided and the very real risk involved in providing it outside any official, legally sanctioned framework. There's a reason this particular line of business proved so remarkably durable across nearly every phase of this organization's long history, surviving economic booms, economic collapses, wars, and sweeping social change alike. Ordinary people's need for fast, reliable, judgment-free access to cash never really disappeared, no matter how much the surrounding economy transformed itself across the decades. Formal institutions, for entirely understandable reasons rooted in prudent risk management, could never fully match the speed and flexibility this informal system offered. And as long as that particular gap remained open, this organization, or something very much like it, was always going to find willing customers ready to walk through the door. It's worth understanding just how socially embedded this lending relationship actually became over time, because it extended well beyond simple transactions between a lender and a borrower into something closer to an ongoing, long-term relationship that shaped how entire neighborhoods functioned economically. A small business owner who had borrowed from a Yakuza-affiliated lender once and repaid reliably often found himself with continued access to fast capital whenever future needs arose, building exactly the kind of ongoing trust relationship a formal bank, with its impersonal risk models and standardized lending criteria, was rarely designed to accommodate. This created a genuinely interesting dynamic within many working-class and lower-middle-class neighborhoods across Japan for much of the 20th century, where an informal economy of fast, personally negotiated credit ran parallel to, and often more efficiently than, the formal banking system most economic textbooks assume is the primary source of business capital in any developed economy. It's worth remembering that formal credit access, even today, remains genuinely unequal, with small businesses and individuals lacking extensive credit histories, often struggling to secure fast capital from banks regardless of which country or era you're examining. The specific mechanism this organization offered, personally negotiated loans backed by informal but genuinely effective enforcement, was solving a problem that persists in some form in nearly every economy that has ever existed, wherever formal institutions move too slowly or too cautiously to match the pace ordinary economic life actually requires. The enforcement side of this arrangement, it's worth being honest, carried real risks and real consequences for anyone who fell seriously behind on repayment. Consequences a formal bank's collections department, however unpleasant, would never actually threaten. This is precisely why formal regulation eventually targeted this entire line of business so directly during the later isolation campaigns described in a much later chapter of this story. For the many decades during which this system operated with minimal outside interference, it filled a genuine economic gap that ordinary financial institutions consistently failed to address on their own. It's also worth noting how this lending relationship interacted with broader Japanese cultural attitudes toward debt and obligation more generally, attitudes that had deep roots stretching back well before any of this organized lending activity ever began. Japanese society across many historical periods placed considerable social weight on honoring debts and obligations promptly, a cultural emphasis that, whatever its origins, made this particular business model considerably more sustainable than it might have been in a cultural context where defaulting carried less social consequence. Borrowers operating within this system understood, often quite deeply, that failing to repay wasn't simply a financial matter to be weighed against other financial priorities. It carried genuine social weight, genuine risk to reputation within a tightly interconnected community, where word of an unpaid debt could travel just as quickly as word of reliable service had traveled during the chaotic post-war years described earlier. This cultural backdrop made the entire lending system considerably more self-reinforcing than a purely transactional analysis might suggest, with social pressure doing at least as much work as any more direct form of enforcement in keeping the whole arrangement functioning smoothly for decades. Post-war Japan needed to rebuild an entire nation essentially from scratch, and that meant construction on a scale the country had genuinely never attempted before in its long history, housing for millions of displaced and returning citizens, factories to restart an economy shattered by years of total war, highways connecting cities that desperately needed faster movement of goods and people. Entire new residential districts rising rapidly, where nothing but rubble and burned foundations had stood only a handful of years earlier. This enormous, sustained building program needed labor, often on genuinely short notice, often in very large quantities that exceeded what any single formal hiring process could reasonably deliver on the timelines construction firms actually required to keep pace with the nation's rebuilding ambitions. Through a practice known within the industry as Tobashi, Yakuza-affiliated groups controlled a substantial portion of the flow of day laborers arriving at construction sites across the country during this critical post-war period. Companies needing reliable workers for a demanding new project could turn directly to these established labor brokers and receive, often within days rather than weeks, a genuinely reliable crew, frequently organized and disciplined in ways that suited the demanding, physically taxing requirements of large-scale construction, work far better than a hastily assembled group of unfamiliar day laborers ever could have managed. This arrangement gave these organizations something valuable that extended well beyond the immediate income generated by controlling labor supply, a genuinely legitimate-looking presence positioned right at the physical heart of an industry that was quite literally reshaping the entire nation, building by building, district by district. It's a bit like discovering, decades after the fact, that the temp staffing agency responsible for your entire office building's construction wing had a very specific, very colorful family history that nobody in the client company's procurement department had bothered to look into carefully before signing what turned out to be a remarkably long-term contract. Relationships formed during this intense period between Yakuza-affiliated labor brokers and major, respectable construction firms proved remarkably durable once established, persisting in various forms for decades after the initial post-war reconstruction boom itself had long since ended, and the nation had moved firmly into a new, more settled phase of sustained economic growth. A relationship built on genuine reliability during a genuine national emergency tends to survive well beyond the specific circumstances that originally created it, precisely because trust, once earned through repeated demonstration under real pressure, becomes its own kind of durable currency within any industry. It's worth noting how naturally this entire arrangement fits the wider pattern already well established by this point in the organization's history, reaching all the way back generations earlier to Japan's original expanding ports. Wherever a fast-growing, genuinely labor-hungry industry needed reliable workers quickly, and needed them organized enough to actually function effectively as a coordinated team, rather than simply a crowd of unfamiliar strangers standing around a job site, this organization's long-accumulated experience organizing disciplined groups of men, first as gamblers running highway dice games, then as dockworkers managing busy ports. Now as construction crews rebuilding an entire devastated nation, gave it a genuine competitive advantage that few purely ordinary, purely legitimate labor markets could ever hope to match on their own, at least not without decades of accumulated organizational experience behind them. Growth throughout this entire national economy's post-war transformation kept opening exactly the kind of gap this particular organization had always known instinctively how to fill, generation after generation, industry after industry, precisely because filling exactly these kinds of gaps had been the organization's core competency from the very beginning, dating all the way back to those original tequila vendors who simply wanted a festival stall nobody else could claim out from under them. It's worth understanding how this labor arrangement gradually transformed as Japan's construction industry itself matured and formalized over subsequent decades, because the relationship didn't remain static throughout this entire period. In the immediate post-war years, when nearly every construction project faced genuine urgency and genuine labor shortages, these labor brokers held enormous practical leverage, simply because reliable workers were scarce and demand for construction labor vastly exceeded supply through any conventional hiring channel available at the time. As Japan's economy matured through the following decades, and as the country's labor market itself became somewhat more formalized and somewhat more regulated, the relationship between construction firms and these labor brokers evolved considerably, though it rarely disappeared entirely. Long-standing relationships, once established during the genuine urgency of the immediate post-war period, tended to persist through simple institutional habit and accumulated trust, even after the original conditions that had made these labor brokers practically indispensable had gradually eased. A construction firm that had relied successfully on a particular labor broker for 2 decades had little practical incentive to suddenly abandon that relationship simply because alternative hiring channels had slowly become somewhat more available. This persistence of relationship, well past the point of genuine practical necessity, is itself worth noting as a recurring pattern throughout this organization's history. Business relationships built during moments of genuine crisis or genuine scarcity tend to outlive the specific conditions that originally created them, precisely because switching to an alternative arrangement carries its own real costs and its own real uncertainty, even once the original justification for the relationship has quietly faded into the background. This dynamic helps explain why so many of the connections this organization built during Japan's chaotic post-war reconstruction persisted for decades afterward, well into an era when the original justification for those particular relationships had largely disappeared. It's worth noting, too, how the physical, visible nature of construction work made this particular business relationship considerably harder to hide than some of the organization's other lines of business, and yet somehow it persisted openly for decades regardless. A loan collected quietly in a back room, or a payment made discreetly to keep a shareholder meeting calm, could remain largely invisible to the general public. A construction crew working visibly on a major public building project, organized and supplied by a known labor broker, was considerably more difficult to keep quiet, and yet this particular arrangement drew remarkably little sustained public controversy for a very long time. Part of the explanation lies simply in results. Buildings got built on schedule to reasonable standards, and the general public, understandably more interested in having reliable housing and infrastructure than in scrutinizing exactly who had organized the labor delivering it, had limited practical incentive to ask uncomfortable questions about a system that was, from their immediate everyday perspective, working exactly as intended. Bars, hostess clubs, and entire entertainment districts across Japan's major cities were, for many decades running, closely tied to Yakuza ownership arrangements, or at the very least, to Yakuza-provided protection arrangements that local business owners felt they genuinely needed given the general absence of reliable, fast police response in many of these busy commercial nightlife areas. Bar owner operating in a particularly busy entertainment district might pay a regular fee for protection against theft, against disruptive or violent customers, against a rival establishment's aggressive attempts to poach business through less than entirely fair means. In other cases, a Yakuza-affiliated group might simply own the establishment outright, operating it as one profitable line of business among the many others the wider organization managed simultaneously across its diverse portfolio. Over time, this deep, sustained connection to the entertainment and nightlife industry extended further into talent management as well, with certain organizations developing genuinely significant, if deliberately quiet, influence over entertainers attempting to navigate Japan's famously competitive and often opaque entertainment industry. An ambitious young performer, uncertain how to secure bookings or protect herself from exploitative venue owners, might find that Yakuza-affiliated management offered exactly the kind of practical protection and industry connections that no purely legitimate agency, at least not one accessible to newcomers without existing connections, could reliably provide. But my genuinely personal favorite piece of this entire sprawling story is Sokaya, because it's the precise moment this whole operation reveals just how remarkably creative it had become by the middle of the 20th century. Someone connected to a Yakuza organization would purchase a small handful of shares in a major, widely respected, publicly traded corporation, purchasing just enough shares to legally qualify for attendance at that company's annual shareholder meeting, nothing more. Once inside that meeting, seated among genuinely legitimate institutional investors and ordinary shareholders, this individual might disrupt the carefully planned proceedings with pointed, deeply embarrassing questions about executive misconduct, questionable expense accounts, or other uncomfortable topics company leadership had hoped to avoid discussing in front of the assembled press. Alternatively, the company might simply agree, quietly and discreetly, to pay this individual a fee to keep the meeting calm, orderly, and entirely free of any uncomfortable surprises for the assembled shareholders and journalists. For decades running, some of Japan's most respected, most internationally recognized corporations simply budgeted for these payments as a routine, unremarkable cost of doing business, a line item nobody particularly wanted to discuss openly in board meetings, but almost nobody within corporate leadership was genuinely willing to test by refusing to pay and risking exactly the kind of embarrassing public disruption these payments were specifically designed to prevent. It might well be the single most expensive method ever devised in the entire history of corporate governance anywhere in the world, of politely asking someone not to raise their hand during a scheduled question and answer session. If loan sharking and controlled construction labor represented this organization filling practical gaps at ordinary street level, Sokaya represented something considerably more ambitious. The precise moment this same organization learned to walk confidently straight through the front door of the corporate boardroom itself, holding an entirely legal ticket purchased through nothing more sophisticated than the ordinary, perfectly legitimate stock market. It's a remarkable illustration of just how thoroughly this organization had woven itself into the deepest machinery of ordinary, respectable Japanese commerce by this particular point in its long history. Even the formal shareholder meeting of a major, internationally recognized company was never entirely free of its quiet, carefully calculated presence somewhere in the room. It's worth examining Sokaya a little further, because the practice reveals something genuinely important about how corporate governance itself functioned, or rather failed to function properly, across large sections of 20th century Japanese business culture. Shareholder meetings are, in theory, supposed to represent one of the primary mechanisms through which ordinary investors hold company leadership accountable for its decisions. The entire premise depends on those meetings functioning as genuine forums for scrutiny, where uncomfortable questions can be raised and genuinely addressed rather than simply suppressed through quiet payment. Sokaya essentially hijacked this accountability mechanism from both directions simultaneously, depending on which side of the transaction a particular Sokaya operator happened to be working. In some cases, Sokaya figures worked on behalf of company leadership itself, accepting payment specifically to prevent other, entirely legitimate shareholders from raising uncomfortable questions, effectively using the threat of disruption to suppress the very accountability shareholder meetings were designed to provide. In other cases, Sokaya figures worked more independently, using the threat of embarrassing public disclosure as genuine leverage to extract payment from companies desperate to avoid scandal regardless of whether the underlying accusations had any real merit. Either way, the practical effect was the same. Shareholder meetings across a substantial portion of corporate Japan became, for decades, considerably less functional as genuine accountability mechanisms than the underlying legal framework assumed they would be. This helps explain why Japanese corporate governance reform eventually became a genuinely significant priority for regulators starting in the later decades of the 20th century, running parallel to, and in some ways connected with, the broader legal campaign against organized crime described in much greater detail later in this story. Cleaning up shareholder meetings and cleaning up organized crime's broader economic influence turned out to be, in a very real sense, the same underlying project, approached from two slightly different regulatory angles. It's worth understanding, too, how these various lines of business, nightlife protection, talent management, and Sokaya, reinforced each other in ways that made the whole portfolio considerably more resilient than any single line of business operating in isolation. Contacts developed through nightlife protection arrangements sometimes proved useful in identifying promising entertainers for talent management. Financial sophistication developed through Sokaya operations, requiring genuine understanding of corporate finance and shareholder law, sometimes proved transferable to other financially complex ventures the organization pursued elsewhere. This kind of cross-pollination between seemingly unrelated business lines is a genuine hallmark of sophisticated, diversified organizations in any industry. And this particular organization, whatever else you might say about it, had clearly developed considerable sophistication in exactly this area by the middle decades of the 20th century. The single largest expansion in this organization's entire long financial history arrived during Japan's extraordinary economic bubble of the 1980s, a period when property values across the entire country soared to numbers that genuinely do not make complete sense even now, looking back on them with the full benefit of historical hindsight. Land in central Tokyo, at the absolute peak of this remarkable bubble, was valued by certain contemporary calculations at figures exceeding the entire combined worth of California, a comparison so extreme it sounds like a deliberate exaggeration, even though it reflects genuinely documented economic analysis from the period itself. Into this extraordinary frenzy of speculative buying and selling, Yakuza-linked financing moved quietly but substantially, weaving itself through the enormous flows of capital reshaping the nation's cities. Loans were extended through carefully structured affiliated finance companies, operating with just enough legitimate paperwork to avoid immediate suspicion. Land was acquired through layers of intermediaries designed specifically to obscure the ultimate source of the capital involved in any given purchase. Development deals were structured with just enough complexity to make tracing the underlying money back to its actual origin considerably more difficult than any casual observer, or even any moderately diligent bank examiner, might reasonably manage without dedicating enormous time and resources specifically to that single task. Legitimate banks, established developers, and respected construction firms all caught up together in a nationwide boom that genuinely seemed, at the time, like it might simply continue rising forever without any meaningful correction on the horizon, were not exactly rushing to trace every single yen flowing through their books back to its precise original source. Everyone involved was making enormous amounts of money. Deals were closing at a genuinely remarkable pace, and asking too many uncomfortable questions about a particular investor's background risked slowing down transactions that competing firms would happily close without any such hesitation whatsoever. By the absolute height of this remarkable period, certain contemporary estimates placed Yamaguchi-gumi's annual income, at its peak, somewhere in the range of billions of dollars, a genuinely staggering figure that places this single organization closer to the earnings reports of an actual Fortune 500 company than to anyone's conventional mental image of what organized crime typically looks like from the outside. This wasn't cash sitting quietly in a vault somewhere, either. It was money continuously, actively reinvested back into an ever-expanding portfolio of legitimate-seeming enterprises, further blurring, year after year, whatever line had once separated underworld money from perfectly ordinary, everyday Japanese commerce. You simply cannot arrest an entire industry, no matter how determined or well-resourced the police force attempting to do so might be. And by the late 1980s, this organization, through decades of patient, incremental expansion into gambling, lending, construction, entertainment, and finally into the very heart of Japan's booming real estate market, had quietly, almost accidentally, become something functionally indistinguishable from an industry in its own right, spread across construction, finance, entertainment, and in considerably quieter and less documented ways, national politics as well. It's worth pausing to consider just how normalized this level of financial entanglement had become by the height of the bubble era, because it wasn't confined to a handful of unusually reckless institutions operating at the margins of respectability. Mainstream banks, respected development firms, and established real estate companies all participated, to varying degrees, in a financial ecosystem where distinguishing legitimate capital from underworld capital had become genuinely difficult even for people working directly within the industry, let alone for outside regulators attempting to monitor the situation from a considerable distance. This normalization happened gradually, deal by deal, relationship by relationship, over years during which the sheer scale of profit available to everyone involved made careful due diligence feel like an unnecessary, even counterproductive, obstacle to closing transactions quickly. A bank executive facing pressure to hit ambitious lending targets, watching competing banks close deals rapidly without excessive scrutiny, had genuine professional incentive to move quickly himself rather than risk losing business to less cautious rivals. Multiply this dynamic across an entire national banking sector during a multi-year speculative boom, and you get exactly the kind of systemic entanglement that made later regulatory cleanup efforts so genuinely difficult and so genuinely slow to produce results. It's worth noting, too, how this entire episode compares to speculative financial bubbles in other countries and other eras, because the underlying pattern, institutions abandoning careful scrutiny during periods of rapid, seemingly limitless growth, is hardly unique to Japan or to this particular organization's involvement in it. What made the Japanese case genuinely distinctive was simply the specific character of who ended up benefiting from that abandoned scrutiny, and how deeply embedded that particular beneficiary already was within the country's broader economic and social fabric, long before the bubble itself ever began inflating. It's worth remembering, too, that this entire bubble-era expansion happened against a backdrop where Japan's broader financial regulatory apparatus was itself still developing considerably less sophisticated tools for tracking exactly this kind of complex, layered capital movement than would eventually become standard practice in subsequent decades. Modern anti-money laundering regulations, the kind requiring banks to trace and report suspicious capital flows in considerable detail, were, at this particular historical moment, either non-existent or in their genuine infancy across much of the developed world, not merely in Japan specifically. This organization wasn't simply exploiting a uniquely Japanese regulatory gap. It was operating during a genuinely global moment when financial systems everywhere had not yet developed the sophisticated tracking tools that would later make this particular style of quiet, layered capital movement considerably more difficult to sustain undetected. For all of this accumulated wealth and this remarkably deep reach into legitimate industries, this organization also maintained genuinely serious, formally written internal rules, distributed to members across the entire country, much like the employee handbook of any large, well-established institution might be distributed to new hires on their very first day. Among the most consistent of these written rules, appearing across many different organizations over many different decades, was a formal, explicit ban on drug use or drug dealing among members, a rule maintained even within organizations that profited, at least indirectly, from various other socially condemned vices without any apparent contradiction troubling their internal leadership. This particular prohibition was partly practical in its underlying logic, since drug use among members could seriously compromise the discipline, judgment, and reliability the entire organization depended on to function smoothly across its distributed network of local branches. But it was also, just as importantly, a matter of carefully maintained public image, since narcotics trafficking carried a level of social condemnation within Japanese society that even these organizations, comfortable as they generally were with various other forms of vice and illegality, actively preferred to avoid being associated with in any public or semi-public way. Many written codes also formally forbade theft directly from ordinary citizens, an inheritance passed down directly from that much older tekia instinct to actively protect the surrounding community rather than prey upon it carelessly. A member caught stealing directly from an ordinary person, rather than from a rival organization or through an established, sanctioned line of business, could face genuinely serious internal punishment, sometimes including complete expulsion from the organization entirely, a consequence that carried enormous social and financial weight for anyone who had built an entire adult life within this particular hierarchy. Disputes between rival groups were, ideally, always settled through careful, formal negotiation between respective bosses, sometimes mediated by a senior, neutral figure genuinely respected on both sides of any given disagreement, rather than through spontaneous, unpredictable violence that risked spiraling out of control and damaging business interests on both sides simultaneously. This preference sounds almost disappointingly civilized when you first hear it described plainly, until you remember that negotiation between bosses, however serious the underlying stakes involved, is still, at the very end of the day, fundamentally just a meeting, complete with an agenda, an expected outcome, and almost certainly at least one participant who arrived having already privately decided exactly what he was, and wasn't willing to concede before the meeting had even formally begun. Even organized crime, it turns out, cannot fully escape the meeting. Funerals carried enormous ritual weight within this culture as well, weight that extended considerably beyond the personal grief experienced by any one individual family mourning its own particular loss. The death of a genuinely senior boss represented a significant public event, sometimes drawing formal representatives from rival organizations who set aside active, ongoing conflicts temporarily, purely out of respect for a shared tradition that ran considerably deeper and stretched back considerably further than whatever specific dispute happened to be currently unresolved between their respective organizations. These solemn, carefully choreographed gatherings reinforced, again and again across the decades, the persistent idea of a shared underlying culture binding even genuinely bitter rivals together in certain particular moments, regardless of whatever business conflicts separated them the rest of the year. Taken together, all of these carefully maintained codes gave the entire organization something resembling predictable internal weather, a set of expectations everyone involved could reasonably rely on even during periods of genuine tension or disagreement between different branches. That predictability, however self-serving its ultimate underlying origins may have genuinely been, made a long, uneasy, but remarkably durable coexistence with ordinary Japanese society, and even at times with the police themselves, possible for far longer than open, unpredictable chaos ever could have realistically sustained on its own. Rules like these, no matter how carefully written down or how consistently enforced across many decades, only survive for as long as leadership itself remains genuinely consistent from one generation to the next. And consistency, as any sufficiently large organization eventually discovers through hard and often painful experience, has an unfortunate tendency to run out at precisely the moment an organization can least afford to lose it. It's worth considering how these written codes actually got transmitted and reinforced across an organization, spanning hundreds of geographically dispersed local branches, because maintaining consistent internal standards across this kind of distributed structure required more than simply printing a handbook once and assuming everyone would follow it indefinitely. Senior members traveling between branches, formal gatherings bringing together leadership from different regions, and the simple accumulated weight of shared ritual and shared tradition all work together to keep these standards genuinely consistent across an organization that, on paper, could have easily fragmented into dozens of only loosely related local cultures, each interpreting the founding rules somewhat differently. This consistency mattered enormously for the organization's broader reputation and broader stability, because a rule that only applied inconsistently across different branches would have quickly undermined the entire premise of predictable internal order that made coexistence with the wider Japanese public possible in the first place. If theft from ordinary citizens was genuinely forbidden in Tokyo, but quietly tolerated in a smaller regional branch, the wider organization's carefully cultivated reputation for maintaining internal discipline would have eroded rapidly, damaging every single branch's standing simultaneously, regardless of how well any individual branch actually followed the rules in practice. This is worth comparing to how any large, geographically dispersed modern organization struggles with the identical challenge of maintaining consistent standards across widely separated branches or franchise locations, where local management inevitably develops its own particular culture over time, sometimes drifting gradually away from official company policy in ways head office only discovers much later. Usually during an uncomfortable audit or an even more uncomfortable public scandal. This organization, whatever else might be said about it, generally managed this particular challenge with remarkable consistency across an enormous geographic footprint and across many decades of sustained operation, a genuine organizational achievement, even when you set aside every other aspect of what the organization actually did with that consistency once it was firmly established. Kazuo Tauka led the Yamaguchi-gumi through much of the middle decades of the 20th century, and under his sustained leadership, the organization pushed aggressively into substantial new territory across Japan, absorbing rival groups that lacked the resources or the will to resist, and extending its reach well beyond its original modest base along the Kobe waterfront into cities that had never previously fallen under its direct influence. This sustained period of aggressive expansion, more than any other single factor in the organization's long history, transformed Yamaguchi-gumi from merely one significant regional player among several into the unquestionably dominant national force it would remain for decades afterward. Expansion on this scale inevitably created serious friction, with established rivals watching their own carefully built territory and hard-won influence steadily erode under sustained competitive pressure. Conflicts flared periodically throughout this entire period of aggressive growth, and this friction was entirely real, involving genuine stakes for everyone caught up in it. Even so, and this remains genuinely worth remembering throughout this whole story, conflict between rival Yakuza organizations tended to be considerably more restrained, more negotiated, and more carefully managed than popular imagination, shaped heavily by dramatic film and television portrayals, usually assumes. Formal truces negotiated directly between rival bosses were genuinely common. Sustained, fully open warfare remained comparatively rare across this entire period, mostly because such warfare proved expensive, disruptive, and genuinely bad for the underlying legitimate and semi-legitimate businesses both competing sides depended on for their actual income. The clearest, most significant exception to this general pattern of restraint followed directly from Tauka's death in 1981. His passing triggered a prolonged, unusually public succession dispute within the organization, as rival factions pressed openly competing claims to overall leadership, each faction backed by senior figures who commanded genuine personal standing and genuine, substantial followings entirely of their own accumulated over many years of loyal service. For a sustained period following Tauka's death, open conflict escalated within the organization in a way it genuinely had not experienced in decades of relative internal stability, and eventually one major faction broke away entirely, forming its own separate, independent organization rather than accepting the particular leadership arrangement that had ultimately emerged from this bitter, prolonged internal dispute. If you have ever personally sat through a family business slowly falling apart over the fundamentally unresolved question of exactly who inherits control once the founding leader has passed away, you already understand the basic emotional shape of this entire story, minus, hopefully, quite so many armed bodyguards standing quietly around the edges of what was functionally an extremely tense, extremely high-stakes shareholder meeting. The underlying dynamics, though, translate remarkably well across contexts. Genuine loyalty built carefully over decades suddenly becomes contested territory the moment the central figure holding everything together is no longer there to arbitrate disputes personally. This significant rupture echoed through the wider organization for years afterward, serving as a genuinely live demonstration of exactly the structural weakness quietly built into that franchise-style structure described earlier in this story. A system held together primarily through shared ritual, shared obligation, and personal loyalty to a central figure is only ever as stable as that underlying loyalty itself remains. When that loyalty becomes genuinely contested, when reasonable people within the same organization can no longer agree on who legitimately deserves it, the very same distributed structure that had always made the organization so remarkably resilient against outside police pressure suddenly became a genuine liability from within, allowing the fracture to spread cleanly along exactly the same organizational lines that had previously made the whole system so effective against external threats. Even at its most turbulent, though, this particular internal conflict stayed largely contained within the organizations directly involved, rather than spilling out broadly into the everyday lives of ordinary Japanese citizens going about their normal business. That containment continued to shape how the wider Japanese public, and Japanese authorities more broadly, perceived this entire phenomenon for years afterward, treating it as a serious internal matter to be carefully monitored and occasionally managed, rather than as an urgent public crisis demanding immediate, forceful government intervention. It's worth considering how this particular succession crisis compares to similar leadership transitions in other large, tightly held organizations built primarily around personal loyalty to a single central figure, because the underlying dynamic recurs with remarkable consistency across very different contexts. Family businesses, religious movements, and even certain political parties have all experienced strikingly similar patterns when a powerful, unifying founder passes away without having clearly, unambiguously settled the question of succession well in advance. Loyalty that had seemed rock solid and permanently settled, while the founding figure remained alive, suddenly reveals itself to have actually been loyalty to that specific individual person, rather than loyalty to the underlying institution itself. And once that distinction becomes clear, competing factions naturally emerge to claim the institutional legitimacy the founder can no longer personally arbitrate. What made this particular succession crisis especially consequential, though, was the scale of what was actually at stake by 1981, considerably larger than what any comparable dispute might have involved decades earlier when the organization was smaller and less wealthy. Tauca's decades of aggressive, successful expansion meant that whoever ultimately emerged from this leadership dispute would inherit control over an organization commanding genuinely enormous resources, extensive territory, and deep influence across multiple industries. The stakes of getting this succession wrong, from the perspective of anyone genuinely invested in the organization's long-term stability, were considerably higher than they might have been for a comparable dispute occurring at an earlier, less consequential moment in the organization's history. This helps explain why the resulting split, when one major faction ultimately did break away to form its own independent organization, proved so consequential and so long-lasting in its effects. A succession dispute within a smaller, less established organization might have resolved relatively quietly, with the losing faction simply accepting reduced influence within the existing structure rather than pursuing full independence. Given the scale of what was genuinely at stake this time, full independence, with all the ongoing complexity and occasional friction that decision would introduce into the wider Yakuza landscape for decades afterward, apparently felt like the more attractive option to the faction that ultimately chose it. For most of the 20th century, Japanese authorities extended this entire organization a long, genuinely ambiguous tolerance that persisted across multiple generations of political leadership. This tolerance had two distinct roots worth understanding separately. Partly, it reflected that old Ninko self-image discussed earlier in this story, making the organization seem manageable and understandable, rather than genuinely urgent or existentially threatening to ordinary Japanese society. And partly, it reflected a simple, practical reality that had become increasingly undeniable by the middle of the 20th century. This organization had grown so thoroughly embedded within everyday economic life, from small-scale lending to major construction projects to popular nightlife districts, that removing it outright seemed both genuinely impractical from a purely logistical standpoint and potentially disruptive to ordinary commerce that countless legitimate businesses had come to quietly depend on. But the highly visible wealth accumulated during the extraordinary bubble years of the 1980s, combined with the increasingly obvious, increasingly well-documented hand these organizations held in major real estate dealings, and embarrassing corporate scandals involving Sokaya payments, finally made that decades-old tolerance genuinely impossible for the government to sustain any longer without facing serious, sustained public criticism. The genuine turning point arrived in 1992 with a comprehensive new law aimed specifically at addressing this problem directly for the very first time in the nation's modern history. And here's the genuinely clever, almost counterintuitive part of this whole strategy worth appreciating fully. The government did not attempt mass arrests, an approach that had already proven largely ineffective across decades of prior experience against a structure this deliberately distributed and franchised. Instead, this new legal approach went after something considerably quieter, considerably more mundane, and ultimately considerably more effective: the simple, everyday ability to conduct ordinary business. Banks began systematically refusing to open accounts for individuals formally identified as known Yakuza members. Companies began refusing to sign contracts, whether for construction, supply, or ordinary commercial services, with anyone carrying a documented known affiliation with these organizations. It's the corporate equivalent of quietly freezing someone out of an important group chat, except in this particular case, the group chat happened to be nothing less than the entire functioning Japanese economy itself. Through the 2000s and continuing well into the 2010s, Individual prefectures across the country pushed this same basic strategy even further, passing local ordinances that made it formally illegal for even an ordinary landlord or a small neighborhood shopkeeper to knowingly conduct business with any known member. The isolation strategy that had once targeted only major banks and large corporations now reached all the way down to the corner store, to the local apartment rental office, to the small family restaurant deciding whether to accept a particular customer's business. An organization that had genuinely survived an entire century of police raids, criminal prosecutions, and open internal rivalry finally encountered the one single obstacle it genuinely could not effectively outmaneuver: simply quietly not being permitted to open a bank account, or sign an ordinary residential lease, or enter into the most routine commercial contract that any ordinary citizen would take completely for granted in daily life. By the 2010s, overall membership numbers had fallen sharply from the organization's post-war peak decades earlier. Younger generations across Japan showed genuinely little interest in joining an organization that now carried real, tangible legal and social costs, while offering a far less certain path toward the wealth and social status it had once so reliably promised to earlier generations of recruits. Fewer young men arrived each year to replace members who were retiring, or leaving the organization entirely, or simply aging out of active involvement altogether. The major syndicates kept fragmenting further under this sustained pressure as well, with additional significant splits occurring within the Yamaguchi-gumi itself during the 2010s, echoing that same painful 1980s succession crisis in smaller, quieter versions repeated again and again across subsequent decades. And in the gaps deliberately left behind by this slow, methodical process of legal and financial isolation, some criminal activity within Japan drifted instead towards smaller, considerably looser networks operating entirely without the old formal codes, the elaborate ceremonies, or the careful internal restraint that had defined the traditional Yakuza for the better part of a century. Some contemporary Japanese law enforcement officials have gone so far as to describe these newer, less structured groups as, in certain important ways, genuinely harder to monitor effectively than the old, established Yakuza organizations ever were, precisely because these smaller networks lack the very visibility, the nameplates and business cards and formal hierarchies, that had all along, somewhat paradoxically, made the traditional Yakuza so strangely, consistently easy to understand, to track, and ultimately, however slowly, to contain. It's a genuinely strange kind of ending when you sit with it for a moment in the quiet. Not a dramatic war, not one single decisive raid that brought the entire towering structure crashing down overnight. Just years upon years of small, quiet, bureaucratic refusals, a bank account denied here, a commercial lease refused there, until an organization that had spent the better part of a century patiently filling every single gap Japanese society happened to leave open finally, gradually, ran out of gaps left anywhere to fill. If you're still awake, that's all right. There's no need to follow the rest. Just let the sound carry you the rest of the way. Good night.